This is Robert Kaplan from the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. This is a podcast series about great power rivalry in an age of global demons.
If Russia continues to interfere with our democracy, I'm prepared to take further actions to respond.
Cyber attacks on the United States, economic coercion.
The United States does not have the qualification to say that it wants to speak to China from a position of strength.
How will conflicts between the United States and China and between the United States and Russia interact with pandemics, climate change, massive cyber attacks, state failures, and other terrors of a global media age? Stay tuned after the podcast for a giveaway of my most recent book, The Good American, The Epic Life of Bob Gersony, the U.S. government's greatest humanitarian. Today, I have with me Nikolas Gvosdev, who is a professor at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, and the editor of FPRI's flagship publication, Orbis, who is really the most astute observer I know of on Eurasian geopolitics. And in this series, as I've been repeating, I'm bringing in people who are not famous, people who are a lot smarter and more interesting than a lot of the marquee famous names you read about in the media. So I'm going to get started with Nick right away. Nick, what is the state of Chinese-Russian relations? Yeah, I remember back in 1969, the two countries were practically at war. And later on, Nixon and Kissinger exploited that tense rivalry between China and Russia into splitting them apart almost by opening to China in order to leverage against Russia, and on and on. Now, of course, it seems like the opposite. It seems that Russia and China appear at least to be closer together diplomatically, strategically, than they've been in many decades, especially considering a long history of border trouble, etc. But is it a tactical alliance? Is it a strategic alliance? What are the tensions? What's really going on there?
Sure. Thank you very much. It's a great way to start out this conversation. I'll just remind the audience that even though I teach at the Naval War College, my comments are going to be my own personal assessments. With that, I think the real $64,000 question, as you put it, is what is the state of the relationship between Russia and China? Is it an alliance? Is it a temporary partnership of convenience? Are these two countries really working together as some sort of entente? Is this just very much a temporary blip in the road? And I think that the short answer is that we don't know, in the sense that Russia and China have some very important equities that are pulling them together, starting with both seeking to counterbalance against the United States. Both of them have certain sets of interests that draw them together. Russia as a resource provider, China as a resource consumer, and particularly for a China that is still worried about the vulnerability of its supply lines, having one of its principal resource providers also be a nuclear armed power indicates a level of comfort that no matter what the United States may want to do, it's not going to be able to strike pipelines and roads and links of communication that feed China's economy from Russian sources without taking an enormous set of risks. And at the same time, Russia, increasingly under sanctions pressure from the West, is turning to China as the supplier of last resort for all sorts of goods and services which U.S. and European firms are unable to provide. And to the extent that China may not offer top-line equipment, but can offer knockoffs of European and American equipment that Russia needs, particularly in the energy sector, which is vital to Russia's ability to remain one of the great powers of the world, is to maintain its position as an energy supplier. There's a degree of interest that ties them together. But there are also points of divergence. China is not interested in automatically giving to Russia a blank check over the Eurasian space. China benefits from having Russia keep out Western influence, but it doesn't mean that China feels that its interests are always served by Russia. We've seen this certainly in the Chinese relationship with Ukraine. Russia has problems with Ukraine, obviously, over the last 7 years. China does not give a blank check, has not, for example, recognized the annexation of Crimea by Russia, still continues to invest in Ukraine, to buy goods and services from Ukraine in a way that Russia may not appreciate. China's presence in Central Asia and the Caucasus is an irritant sometimes to Russia because Chinese economic influence gives the states of those regions an alternative to always having to deal with Moscow. And although Russia likes to present itself as the indispensable geographic linkage between the East Asian Sino-sphere and Europe, and the idea what the Russians have been pitching over the last number of years is that Europe and China both need Russia for the land route, for the Northern Sea route. China also is developing alternatives to reach Europe that do not touch Russian territory, that go through Central Asia, through Iran, across the Caspian, through the Black Sea, into the Mediterranean. And at the same time, while Russia is very interested in China's investment, Russia has been one of the strongest members of the Arctic Council to insist that China cannot come up with this new designation of a near Arctic power, and therefore to have a right or to have a seat at the table where Arctic decision making is made. So even though the two countries coordinate in many areas, the Arctic is one of the biggest areas of divergence between Moscow and Beijing. So it's a little bit more than a tactical alliance. Right now, both Moscow and Beijing feel that they have real problems with the United States, and this is what kind of holds their relationship together. It's also held to some extent by personal ties. Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have had a degree of personal chemistry. It doesn't guarantee that Putin's successor and Xi's successor will have that same degree of rapport, because that has also enabled Russia and China, when they've had some of these disputes or have had some of these irritants, Putin and Xi have been prepared and willing to work it out at the leader-to-leader level. But that's not something that is guaranteed to last for the future. And finally, and just on the last point, a variety of countries, we see this with Germany, we see this certainly with Japan and with India, are looking for ways to incentivize that Russia, while it's going to be close to China, doesn't get too close. This has been an important reason why Japan has never signed on fully to a full range of sanctions against Russia, because the Japanese fear is a Russia that is forced by sanctions to move closer into the embrace of China is a real threat to Japan's national security. India, of course, has a robust military partnership with Russia. While it's developing one with the United States, certainly it doesn't want to foreclose that relationship. So the Indians have pushed back on U.S. sanctions that they feel might hurt them. And then finally, in Europe and Germany as the leader, I think very much of concern to German leaders is to make sure that Russia remains in a more equidistant position between Russia and China, and certainly to ensure that there's still a considerable degree of interdependence between Russia and Europe. Again, even at the expense of Germany parting ways with the United States on increased sanctions on Russia, as we've been seeing over the last 2 years with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline.
Okay. Okay.
A lot of stuff there.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff there. We're going to take a short break, and when we return, Nick and I will discuss how U.S. policy can be used to strategically pull Russia and China apart. Stay tuned.
This podcast is sponsored by the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. Founded in 1955, FPRI is committed to producing the highest quality scholarship and expert analysis through the lens of history, geography, and culture. For more information about FPRI and our work to educate the public on the most pressing foreign policy issues of the day, please visit www.fpri.org. www.fpri.org.
To what degree is U.S. policy under Trump and now under Biden pulling Russia and China together? I imagine it goes further than just lectures on morality and human rights, but that has to be a part of it. Do we have a role to play? And although we're not going to split the two apart like in 1972, are there ways where through a very subtle policy, we could pry them apart a little bit, play them off against each other a little bit? And of course, I would think that would involve having a policy that's more than one-dimensional human rights. It will involve a certain level of compromise.
That's, I think, a critical question, and it requires a degree of agility in U.S. policy that I'm afraid we don't always have, because it requires policymakers and strategists in the United States to really be able to prioritize what matters. I think one of the things that has driven Russia and China closer together is the United States over the last 10, 15 years really has taken the position of almost reflexive support whenever Russia or China have a dispute, whether it's justified or not justified or anything, to automatically, almost reflexively say, well, whoever is in dispute with Russia or China, that is who the United States ought to support. So we've seen that where, and again, not talking about Ukraine, which of course is a major violation of international law, but even in other areas in the Eurasian space with Russia, where the sense is that the United States has been so quick to automatically offer support to a partner or to a country that's in dispute with Russia, that Russia therefore assumes that the United States is going to be against us. The United States doesn't recognize any of our legitimate political or economic or security interests. And so who's the country that is willing to do it? It's going to be China. Similarly with China, I think as we look at a very dynamic environment in the Indo-Pacific region, whether it comes to territorial disputes, claims, everything like that, if the United States has moved into a position where the de facto switch is China is always in the wrong, it's going to move Russia and China to say, well, we're going to have to work closer together. So to some extent, we have to have an agility to see, well, where is it possible to perhaps offer accommodations from time to time that don't negatively impact core U.S. interests, but where we could accommodate Russia or China and then find a way to see if this can produce a greater degree of equidistance between Beijing and Moscow. Same thing when it comes to issues like Syria, where we've seen that kind of Russia and China formed this dynamic duo in the Security Council in terms of pushing back against the United States. There were, signals being sent from Russia at various points about looking for compromises in Syria. Same thing with Venezuela. The Russians had signaled and have signaled at several points that they might be interested in pursuing compromises with the United States. If our side is to either have a reflexive, we want the whole enchilada or nothing, or that we don't want to recognize, as you opened our segment with, that we are in a world of great powers, each of whom have capabilities and abilities to impose their agendas. If we're not willing to make some adjustments to that, and going back to your example from the 1960s and the 1970s, we have turned the Nixon doctrine on its head. The idea that Moscow and Beijing should feel that their relationship with Washington is more important than their relationship with each other. We've now created a situation. It started, I would argue, in the second half of the Obama administration, continued in the Trump administration, seems to be on autopilot now in the Biden administration, where for the time being, Moscow and Beijing feel that their relationship with each other is more important. And I don't think it's a good approach for U.S. policy to say, well, we're going to wait for the inevitable Russo-Chinese war of 2050 to somehow settle this, because between now and 2050, a lot of things can happen.
I want to take you to Europe for a moment and then back to Russia and Moscow. The Germans have been very critical of Russian human rights violations. They've given medical support to a Russian dissident, Alexei Navalny. They've sanctioned Russia, but one thing they have not done and probably will not do is cancel the Nord Stream 2 project. And is that cannot only be because Germany needs the natural gas. For instance, it can get natural gas increasingly from the U.S. LNG, from new it finds in the Eastern Mediterranean with pipelines. This, to me, Nick, seems like Germany saying we're doing this in order to stabilize our relations with Russia, because Russia is just too big, too close, and Putin shows no signs of giving up power. He seems very secure in power. So Nord Stream 2 is a way to stabilize Europe with Russia. Do you agree with that?
That's a great way of looking at it. And I think it shows the extent to which the German approach isn't just, as you said, simply a matter of economics, or what you often hear here, or economic corruption of elites in Germany by Gazprom, but it is part of a larger German strategic assessment. And that assessment has two parts which are really aligned against sort of the conventional wisdom in Washington. First is the Germans do not buy into the declinist fantasy, which, and I'll be very blunt in labeling that, which so many people in Washington seem to have, which is Russia is a threat, but Russia is going to be gone. We've been hearing this, the late Senator McCain was saying after the financial crisis of 2008, Russia is finished. They can't sustain themselves. It really starts to sound like the Cubans in South Florida, that every year was the year that Fidel Castro was going to go. The Germans don't have that view. They look at Russia. They understand that Russia has weaknesses. The Russian system is brittle, but they also see that Russia is a player. Russia's not going to be disappearing anytime soon. It's going to be an actor in European affairs. So they don't believe in some magic color revolution that's somehow going to solve all of Europe's strategic problems with Russia. And so therefore, the Germans have always said you have to have both an approach that is based upon firmness, but also on engagement. And they see the pipeline as part of that engagement strategy. They see it as a way to develop interdependence. The Germans will also tell you, particularly in offline conversations, that they've actually had more success than the United States in getting certain objectives that the Western alliance holds important with Russia by their ways of doing things, right? So one of our big concerns is, well, if Russia stops gas transit through Ukraine, it's a $3 billion a year hole in the Ukrainian budget, which certainly the United States isn't going to fill. The Germans, and so the argument was, well, the U.S., we're going to pressure the Russians not to build this pipeline, and that will secure Ukraine. And of course, every year the pipeline, basically the pipeline is about 100 kilometers left to go. So that U.S. approach perhaps hasn't been as successful. The Germans will say, we got the Russians to sign an agreement on the dotted line that guarantees that Russia will continue some gas transit through Ukraine. So the German approach has been to say, look, our approach of being firm, we brought in Navalny, we gave him the health care. The Germans would argue that one reason why Navalny is still alive today is not because of denunciations from Capitol Hill, but it's because of this very quiet German lobbying effort in Russia. Now, we could say that's self-serving on the German part, but the Germans would say that their approach is more likely to get at least some degree of compromise with Russia that serves interest. And again, their critique of us is that we have this all-or-nothing approach, which doesn't recognize that when you do an all-or-nothing approach, one of the options you might get is nothing.
Yes.
Whereas the Germans are saying, we want to at least get something. And we think that our approach of engagement with Russia is more likely to produce something rather than everything.
We're going to take a short break. Stay tuned.
If you're enjoying the Global Demons podcast, you'll also enjoy Robert D. Kaplan's latest book, The Good American, a sweeping yet intimate story of the most influential humanitarian you've never heard of, Bob Gersony, who spent 4 decades in crisis zones around the world. Thanks to our sponsor, Random House, you can win a signed copy of The Good American just by listening to this podcast. All you have to do is subscribe to this podcast and leave a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We will have a random drawing and announce the winner on our 13th and final episode.
Nick, one could say that in the amoral world of geopolitics, with longevity comes legitimacy. Putin has been in power for 2 decades now. He became acting president in early 2000 and became, I think, president in May 2000. All right. How would you characterize the Russian regime now? What would you define it as, essentially, and how stable is it? Because, the Western media does not help. Often. Every time there's a demonstration, it covers it in depth, but between one demonstration and the other, there's no substantial coverage of analyzing dispassionately the Russian regime.
Yeah, no, I think that's important because when you cover a demonstration and the view is that this time, this is the one that's going to do it. Right, that's going to lead to change. And some of this is the hangover, I think, of the fact that we were so caught, at least our analytic and political communities were so caught by surprise by the collapse of the Soviet Union that now no one wants to be saying, well, the Russian regime is stable and then have it fall on CNN the next week. And then everyone says, why didn't you see it coming? But beyond that, I think it misses the point. And this also, by the way, comes to another point that I'll connect in with policy, which is, over the last number of years, what's our approach been to Russia? Cut dialogue, cut engagement, both sides continue to prevent people from traveling back and forth. And what's happening is we're losing contact with a new generation of Russian leaders that are being developed. Putin understands. He may want to stay around for a lot longer, and I can understand that. But he also understands that when he goes, he wants to know that there are people that will continue in the vein that he has directed. We've seen over the last number of years, a lot of that original cohort that came in with Putin, people have retired. He has a new prime minister that doesn't get a lot of attention here, Prime Minister Mishustin, because he's not a colorful figure, and also not somebody that we really know anymore, right? This is part of that. We're dealing with a bench of Russians that we got to know in the 80s and 90s, and we're not meeting with Russians as much anymore. And so we're seeing new figures start to emerge that we don't really have that degree of contact with. But between the new prime minister, not so new as much because he's been around now for a year and a half, plus people in the presidential administration, we've seen about half of Russia's governors replaced with younger people. He's really moving to create this cadre of 35 to 45-year-old officials, with many of these people, and your point about that he's been in power really for more than 2 decades, it also means he's had the chance to cognitively imprint his views about geopolitics, about the Russian state, so on a whole generation of officials that are rising up to handle these tasks. The fact that Russia got through coronavirus, perhaps not with sterling colors, but perhaps not doing as poorly as might be expected, testifies that there are degrees of resilience in the Russian regime. Now, its weakest point is that none of this is very institutionalized. This is still a very highly personalized system through connections, through networks of people. It's not, you had Russians who really looked at, Japan's Liberal Democratic Party or India's Congress Party as models. How do you create a kind of institutional party that can govern for decades? That's the weak part of the system, and it is personality dependent. So if Putin has a health crisis, we don't have a lot of institutional ballast. But the sources of strength for the Russian government are that it's not just 1 or 2 people at the top. It is now a whole, it comes down through several levels. There are interest groups that are aligned with the state and with this regime. It's, it is authoritarian. I mean, people will take the terms and slice and dice them. But in some ways, it's a Napoleonic regime, right? That it still seeks validation through elections, through referenda, which are managed, but nevertheless, the sense that that there must be some at least appearance of a popular acquiescence.
That's very interesting, Nick. I just came back from Egypt. And one of the things that I learned about the Mubarak regime was Mubarak grew old with his advisors, or rather his advisors grew old with him. He never, he was in power 30 years, but he never replaced his advisors. He never developed a new cadre. And so the regime was very sclerotic. And in the last 2 years before the Arab Spring, 2009 to 2011, there was really nothing going on in the regime at all. And it seems that Putin is doing the opposite, because when you're in power a long time, the challenge is people around you who you trust and have much in common with grow old, and you've got to replace them. You've got to find new blood that you can also trust, and bring them up. It sounds from listening to you that Putin is doing this. He's much more of an activist kind of dictator than Mubarak was in that sense. I want to move along and ask you about Russian policy. How do the Russians see Europe post-Soviet near abroad, in Europe and in the Middle East? Somewhat, because it seems to me that Russia's goal is to recreate in informal, soft, imperial-like terms the borders of the old Soviet Union.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Russian view is would be very recognizable to Metternich or Castlereagh or anyone from the 19th century. It is that great powers sit at the top table, and they're great powers because they are agenda setters. They can set the agenda. Middle powers can negotiate, small powers have to accept. And so the Russian view is that Russia is one of those agenda-setting powers, that Europe has more or less reached the limits that it can comfortably digest, that China, and of course, one of the things the Russians always encourage China to do is to think Pacific. And therefore, there is this zone, Central Eurasia, Northern Middle East, that Russia ought to be the great power that is the primary agenda setter for, and that other major powers want and sustain Russia in its ability to do that, right? That this isn't just, you don't expend a lot of your resources to be a great power and then drain yourself. You should position yourself where other great powers say, we need you to play this role because we don't want to play it, or it's not in our interest to do so. So we've seen in the Middle East the very dramatic return of Russia over the last 5 to 7 years into the Middle East, not just Iran and Syria, but the relationship with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, with Egypt. But it's not that the Russians aren't coming in the way the Soviets did with a lot of giveaways. They're coming in and saying, we can play a role, but there are things you're going to have to do for us. The Saudis, you're going to coordinate with us on energy markets. With a number of countries, you are going to, the Gulf Emirates, you're going to take some of that investment capital that you have, and you're going to put it in Russian projects. Israel, you're going to help our high technology sectors in Russia develop. And so this idea of Russia as a great power, agenda-setting power, a power that can come in and can kind of regulate and do so, but also where other countries say, we will sustain you as a great power for doing these things for us. That really much seems to be at the heart of the Russian approach. And what the Russians are doing, they did this particularly during the Trump administration. We'll see how much this continues in the Biden years, is to also then say, look, the United States is now unreliable. The United States can turn on a switch. They can come in one day, leave the next, but we the Russians we don't overpromise, and we can, try to help negotiate jury rig arrangements, whether in Syria or in the Gulf or elsewhere. Whereas the Americans, they show up, then they leave, they commit, then they go. So the Russians have definitely been trying to portray themselves as more reliable.
Yeah. One last question, quick answer. How is Russia and China getting along in Central Asia? Because on the one hand, it's a former Soviet space with linguistic affinity to Russia. On the other hand, the Chinese have the money, and the market. So very quickly, what's going on in Central Asia?
Uneasy cohabitation, if you want the quick answer, precisely for the reasons that you gave. China has the money. but the states of Central Asia, particularly their governments, still rely on Russia for a lot of the, shall we say, assistance that they need to maintain themselves. So it's uneasy, but at this point, it works because they're both worried about Central Asia as a backyard for which they do not want the United States there. So, of course, as much as they may publicly worry about the fate of Afghanistan, our departure will bring to an end concerns about Central Asia being that a backdoor for the United States, both against Russia and China.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. This has been brilliant. It's been a brilliant half hour. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Global Demons podcast, brought to you by the Foreign Policy Research Institute. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts and visit our website at www.fpri.org. For the Foreign Policy Research Institute, I'm Robert D. Kaplan.